Hey folks, it's Strixhaven season. I asked my patrons which of the new precons I should review, and Lorehold narrowly beat out Silverquill to be the top result. So, what's going on with Lorehold? I'll get into the details later, but to start with, I'll say that this is definitely one of the weaker precons I've reviewed. That's not necessarily saying a lot, since I've only reviewed 7 total, and the last 2 were quite excellent precons, but it does make for a fun deviation from a lot of the more powerful precons we've been seeing lately. Before I get into this precon's key issues and how we can go about solving them, let's give a quick rundown on this deck's game plan. The face commander is Quintorius History Chaser. This is a 4-mana planeswalker with the passive ability, whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. His +1 ability reads, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards, then mill a card. His -4 ability reads, spirits you control gain double strike and vigilance until end of turn. My first thought here is that this is actually a pretty good package. The passive can be a good source of bodies on board to block when paired with other things, the +1 is a good source of value and graveyard filling, and the -4 can let the deck round the corner and push toward victory after it's been churning with leaving graveyard synergies for a while. Along with this excellent set of abilities comes the downside that Quintorius History Chaser is a planeswalker, and can thus be attacked by opposing creatures to get him off the board for basically free. To me, what this means is that you'd want blockers to be able to keep opposing creatures at bay, so my first instinct is that in most cases you'd probably want to wait an extra turn or two to set up synergy pieces before casting this, rather than just slamming it down on curve. So, how is this deck choosing to make use out of this command zone? Well, as far as synergies go, there are 19 cards that recur, exile, or otherwise remove things from the graveyard, along with 5 things beyond the commander that are payoffs for cards leaving the graveyard. To pair with these, there are 12 cards outside the commander that help cards get into the graveyard, though 7 of these are pretty insubstantial, so I guess we could say that there are 5 cards that are proper graveyard enablers. As an added layer of synergy, there are some discard payoffs, with Currency Converter, Conspiracy Theorist, and Containment Construct all letting the deck accumulate extra resources off of discarded cards in some form or other, and these compare nicely with the commander. As a final bit of cohesion, the deck has 19 creatures that are spirits, 5 other cards beyond the commanders that create spirit tokens, and another few cards that synergize with spirits in some other way. Between this wide-ranging synergy core, moderate counts of draw and ramp, and a nice though somewhat narrow span of cards to interact with opposing plays, this deck is looking to outgrind opponents and assemble an army of spirits before swinging in big. So that's the plan. But how is this plan likely to work out in practice? To start with some things I like about this deck, there are a lot of cool game plan elements that work together pretty cohesively. Leaving graveyard payoffs paired with an assortment of different recursion effects make for a satisfying pairing, where you're being rewarded for doing things that already feel good to do. I also think the scale of this deck's plan for winning makes a lot of sense. You've got a commander that can churn out a lot of tokens, and who can also make those tokens hit like a truck with his -4, and this is paired with a generally grindy game plan and some number of creature buffing effects. I even had some luck getting engines to come together in decent time when I was doing my test games with this precon. The average synergy core the deck had put together by the end of turn 5 was actually better than it was for the Blight Curse precon I reviewed a couple months ago, even if the number of total dud games was a bit higher here. So where do the problems of this deck I was mentioning come from? Fundamentally, there are a few issues with the way this deck functions, and the biggest one is that it puts a lot of pressure on its Planeswalker commander to stick around on board. As I said earlier, there are 5 cards in the 99 I'd consider decent or good options for getting cards in the graveyard, with a handful of others that offer a weaker version of this. And what that means is that the commander is going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting to keep the deck's graveyard stocked. This feature of the deck is compounded by its options for value generation, which largely don't come online that early in the game. 7 of the 12 options I've categorized under value cost 5 or more mana, require some sort of setup, or more or less require that the commander stick around in play. The remaining options aren't even that amazing, containing things like Fateful Tempest that gives opponents more agency over our fate than I'd like, as well as Lelia, who needs to be attacking, and therefore not blocking, in order to generate value. This is relevant because the commander is a planeswalker, a card that opponents can attack with their creatures to kill as long as they can get around blockers. Planeswalkers are much better in 20 health 1v1 formats because there's only one opponent you need to worry about swinging in, and the lower life total means that a Planeswalker soaking up a bit of damage can be genuinely helpful in its own right. In Commander, though, the massive life totals mean that attacking opponents often feels barely useful anyway in the earlier stages of the game, but attacking a Planeswalker can mean eliminating an opposing threat without needing to spend a card. I've also been in a lot of situations where an opponent will use a removal spell on a chunky creature I have in play to block for my Planeswalker, which then ends up making that removal spell a 2-for-1, since it lets my opponents collectively thwack my Planeswalker to death as well. Now, all of this doesn't mean that Planeswalkers are totally unusable in EDH, or even that a Planeswalker commander is a bad choice. This version of Quintorius is much more powerful than the previous creature iterations, if you can keep him around on board, and I could imagine a universe in which you wait to play Quintorius until you have some tools to keep him around, or at least until you're able to get a couple spirits off him the same turn to block with. The problem is, this deck isn't designed to do that. It usually feels clunky and awkward without the commander. Its graveyard filling options too sparse, and its value engines too techy and conditional. If I'm packing a handful of payoff, I'm going to be wanting to run out this bad boy as soon as possible, and that could mean putting him in a very precarious position on board. This feature of the deck is worsened by its Manabase, which is honestly the most disappointing Precon Manabase I've reviewed since the first one I reviewed, Blame Game. Despite my best efforts, 5 of my 20 test games with this deck saw a missed early land drop, and part of the issue here is the raw count of 37. This can be a perfectly fine number of lands to run if you've got a decent amount of early draw, filtering, or land cycling that can dig you to more, but this deck doesn't really have any of these things. I honestly don't understand why we're still getting precons with fewer than 39 lands in an era with ample quality MDFCs and utility lands that can be added to decks. It seems like we're just dooming newer players to have unnecessary mana screw games. Beyond the raw count, the mana base is also awkward in some other ways. Its symbol counts are high due to running a very high number of tapped duels, but this also means some extra clunkiness in the early game, and there are some baffling inclusions like Mistveil Plains, Study Hall, and Lotus Field that add to the awkwardness. The end effect of all of this is making the commander's filtering feel even more essential for smoothing and finding land drops, and I have to imagine this will play out poorly in practice a lot of games. For my test games, I used the rule that Quintorius would survive the turn cycle as long as I had one blocker for each turn past 3, but honestly, I'm pretty sure that testing policy is not nearly conservative enough to account for what a harsh environment an EDH game is for Planeswalkers, even at bracket 2. Beyond the issue of over-reliance on the commander, there are a couple other things this deck has going against it, in my eyes. One of these is an issue that sort of compounds on that last one, a vulnerability to graveyard hate. In theory, effects that exile your graveyard shouldn't be the end of the world for this deck, since it's looking for more of an incremental graveyard plan rather than one that builds up a massive yard full of stuff. However, what makes it a potential issue here is, once again, the lack of non-commander ways to get stuff into the yard. I can easily imagine Quintorius creeping up in command tax over time, and though he's pretty quick at creating a graveyard with enough fodder to last a while, if somebody exiles your graveyard, you're right back to square one. This deck broadly seems designed to be grindy and increase in power over the course of a game, but graveyard hate will also increase in frequency over the game, as opponents are able to access more of their libraries, and without enough ways to feed the graveyard, I could see the late game being a bit awkward for this deck as well. The final issue I see here is with interaction. Some of what's here I don't mind. All 3 of the 5-mana board wipes seem pretty sweet, and there are other cards like Skyclave Apparition and Lorehold Charm that seem likewise well situated. However, the overall amount here does not impress me, particularly for a deck that's grindy and might take a bit to get going. I've categorized 11 cards here as interaction, but that's probably a bit generous given that 3 of the cards included in that group are Kami of Ancient Law, White Orchid Phantom, and Remorseful Cleric, filler spirits with somewhat mediocre attached interactive tools. These seem significantly more likely to be chump blockers for Quintorius than cards actually used against what opponents are doing, which is fine, but I feel like I'd honestly rather just have a Wall of Omens at that point. Overall, this interaction issue will likely be felt in this deck struggling to slow opponents long enough to get its own plan up and running, though I will say that an improvement to the deck's card economy could help quite a bit with this, all on its own. Alright, so these are the issues I see here. Too reliant on the commander for draw and graveyard filling, a bit vulnerable to graveyard hate, and containing not enough interaction. So how do we go about fixing these things? Well, weakness to graveyard hate is tied in with the deck's graveyard feeding, and quantity of available interaction is tied into the deck's card economy, so we're really going to be focused on these first 2. Let's start with cuts. This deck has some kind of filler 2 and 3 cost creatures, and while I see the desire to have blockers, I just can't get fully on board with these. Kami of Ancient Law and White Orchid Phantom are some 2-drop spirits I mentioned earlier and don't really care for. If you're going to have a Phantom in your deck, you could at least have the decency to pair it with an indestructible land and try to convince me it's ramp. Another cut is Nactamoon Lore Spinner. This is probably going to be a very cool piece of tech in Eternal formats, but in a grindy EDH deck with a value engine commander, it feels out of place. Another cut is going to be Drumbellower. This is likewise far from a bad card, but it feels pretty underutilized here given that the commander's -4 already offers vigilance on any turn you'd want to be swinging wide. Moving along to higher cost creatures, I'm cutting the 2 Neon Dynasty dragons. These are also perfectly fine cards, but they kinda just seem like blockers here, and I'm not particularly sold on their beatdown potential with Quintorius' -4 either. This deck is stacked with powerful 5-drops, so I'm also cutting Karmic Guide and Balefire Liege. The former is a passable recursion spell, and the latter is a guy that buffs the board, but doesn't do a whole lot else. Finally, as non-creature cuts, we are axing Fateful Tempest and Monologue Tax. The latter is kinda a poor ramp spell in general, IMHO, and though I see the appeals of Fateful Tempest, I dislike its unreliability, and I also wanted to cut a non-creature spell to avoid having our creature count dip too low. Now for the additions, 10 cards that each cost $3 or less. To start with, I want to see a couple MDFCs in here to make sure we're hitting our land drops. Witch Enchanter is a no-brainer for a deck that doesn't have a whole ton of non-creature permanent removal at the moment, and Makindi Stampede feels nice as a way to replace the spirit buffing of Balefire Liege. Next up, let's get a whole bunch more draw and filtering in here. From the main set, I'm pulling Arc of Hunger, cool-ass card name and art by the way, and Pursue the Past, both of which help fill our graveyard and generate card advantage. Something I've been noticing more and more is Wizards of the Coast including fairly obvious additions to precons within the main set, which seems nice as a way to get newer players started in tuning their decks. Another filtering spell I'm adding is Fear of Missing Out, which is a nice blocker that can offer some crazy Alpha Strike potential with Quint's -4 later in the game, since that loyalty ability also gives Vigilance. Tersa Light Shatter is another addition with a similar profile, an immediate burst of filtering, a blocker in the short term, and a value engine once your graveyard hits threshold. Brass's Tunnel Grinder also fits this mold, not including a body to block with, but being an even better filtering tool and an even better value engine later in the game. As a 6th and final filtering inclusion, we're adding good old Plurg. I love that we get to include the Lorehold Flipdean from the previous Strixhaven set, and a 2-drop creature who can tap to Rummage is exactly what this deck is looking for. Alright, now that we've eaten our vegetables with these first 8, I have 2 more fun additions. On Wings of Gold is an enchantment printed in the Aetherdrift Zombie Precon, and its appeals are simple. It's an extra leaving graveyard payoff, and possibly more importantly, it gives our spirits +1/+1 in flying, further improving this deck's ability to punch in for damage. For my final inclusion, I'm adding the flip card, Mila and Lucca. The front side is a nice fox friend to help defend Quintorius, and the back side is a top-end planeswalker that plays nicely into the deck's graveyard themes. Alright, those are my 10 cuts and additions. Overall, this precon is operating in some fun mechanical territory, and this style of red-white deck is really unique and deserves to be seen more. It does also feel pretty Lorehold to me, and I like that we still managed to get a few new arts for cards even in a set with 5 precons. Also, with this set, we finally finished the Tango and Bicycle land cycles, after 11 and 9 years, respectively. Budget-type dual land enjoyers, rejoice! So broadly, I don't mind this precon, or even the fact that it has some issues that make it a bit suboptimal. That said, I would prefer that precons steer away from the sorts of issues that make it likely for them to stall out. Not enough lands, over-reliance on the commander, and especially not enough filtering. What I mean by filtering is cards that prioritize letting you see more of your library over value or increasing your total card pool. This phrase accurately describes 5 of my 10 additions, even if 4 of those are also capable of being value positive, and the appeal of these in something like a precon is very straightforward. Seeing more of your deck is good. Seeing more of your deck lets you play more of your deck, put together more interesting combinations of cards from your deck, and if nothing else, lay your eyes on and hold within your fingers a greater proportion of the cardboard that exists within your deck. That is going to be enjoyable for most decks, but it's especially important for precons. Imbuing players with a sense of agency should be the #1 goal here, and that's what friends like Plurg are here for. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. Architect's multi-layered category system makes it easy for me to dig into decks like I did here, and the Maybe Board categories system is great for displaying something like additions and cuts. A link to my upgrade of this precon is in the description. Also, if you're in the market for high-quality sleeves with a great variety of different colors and designs, you can pick yourself up some Dragon Shield sleeves at my affiliate link in the description, using code SALUBRIOUS for 5% off. If you want to support me more directly, you can sign up for my Patreon, or sign up for a YouTube membership. Those lovely people get bonus videos from me once a month or so, and some of them get to be featured in my credits as well. Don't you want to see your name on screen?